welcome to today's program. My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, devoted to perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust rescuer, Aristides de Sousa Mendes. Today's program, Hidden Children and Their Rescuers, is part of our series that we have been running since the month of April, presenting beautiful stories of rescue and hope. And rescue can be seen under multiple lenses, large acts of rescue or individual acts of rescue. And today we're going to focus on the hidden child, which is really an individual act of rescue that was replicated across Europe many thousands of times. We're privileged today to have three distinguished speakers: Abe Foxman, who you all know, and who was a hidden child in Poland; Ruth Cap-Hearts, who is a Holocaust educator and teacher and a biochemist. She was a hidden child in France; and Dr. NOEMI Perelman Mattis, who also happens to be my mother, who was a hidden child in Belgium. Let me just say that today's program is co-sponsored by two other organizations. The organization, Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, headed by Ellen Greenberg, whom you'll meet in a minute, and the Hidden Child Foundation, directed by Rochelle Goldstein, and I'm very grateful to them both. So right now I'm going to turn the floor over to Ellen, who is going to tell a little bit about her organization. She's going to also introduce our first guest, but I do have one more thing to tell you, and that is that unfortunately today we will not be taking audience questions for our speakers because of the size of the group. So you're welcome to use the chat box, and we will certainly be sharing the contents of the chat box with our speakers. But unfortunately, there won't be the time to have the direct exchange with the questions today.
Simone is on here.
So I'm going to ask people to mute themselves who are not muted, please. And I'm going to turn the floor now over to my friend Ellen Greenberg. Ellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. And thank you for asking us to participate in today's wonderful program. And thank you for all the guests and everyone being here. I am the daughter of two Holocaust survivors and co-founder with Dr. Eva Fogelman of 2G Greater New York, Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, a forum for sharing thoughts and learning about the Holocaust. We offer discussion groups, workshops, and have a vibrant group on Facebook. I am actively involved in Holocaust education and remembrance. I run programs, write articles, and lead discussion groups for descendants of survivors. Following in my parents' footsteps, I speak at schools, synagogues, and other forums and tell their stories and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our group, 2G Greater New York, which has now become Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, has many exciting programs coming up that I'm going to tell you about very briefly. On Wednesday, August 26th, Survivors, Secrets, and Lies, a conversation with authors Helen Fremont and Meryl Ain about their recently published books. In September, this is the first time it's being announced, Dr. Eva Fogelman will be interviewing Elisha Wiesel, son of Elie Wiesel, a program in partnership with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. You can find this on our website and Facebook, and all that information will be put in the chat, and we hope you'll join us. My father, Fred Bachner, survived Auschwitz and other concentration camps. Like today's speakers, my mother, Ruth Bachner, was a hidden child. And I believe Matt is going to show some pictures of my mom during the war. In 1940, my mother and her family fled their homeland, Austria, for Belgium, which was invaded by the Germans a few weeks later. Jewish people were no longer safe, so her family went into hiding. My grandparents as domestics in a chateau, my mother's brother in an orphanage, and my mother was hidden in a convent, renamed Marie Renee Leroy, and was later baptized. She was hidden in the convent for 2 years. Luckily, my mother and her family were reunited after the war and emigrated to the United States in 1947. Unfortunately, my mom, Ruth Backner, passed away this past May from COVID-19. Okay. I'm just sorry about that. Our first guest today, Abraham Foxman, was with the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, for over 50 years, serving as National Director for 28 years and as National Director Emeritus since 2015. He currently serves as head of the Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. During his long and distinguished career, Abe has been awarded several honors from nonprofit groups, religious figures, and statesmen. He has met with several popes and global leaders and is known throughout the world as a leader in the fight against anti-Semitism, hatred, prejudice, bigotry, the war on terrorism, and discrimination of any kind. Abe continues to speak out on issues of religious intolerance, support for gay rights, and Holocaust deniers and revisionists. Every hidden child has their own story. Abe is here to share his unique and fascinating story as a hidden child during the Holocaust. It is my pleasure to introduce Abe Foxman.
Hi.
Hi. So if you want to give us a little bit of background and tell us about your family before the war, where you were born, and what Jewish life was like.
My parents were married in Warsaw. My father came from Baranovich, which was then Poland, now Belarus. When the war broke out, they moved to Baranovich, moving east, hoping to stay ahead of the Germans. I was born in Baranovich in 1940. My parents then, again, how they made the decisions, they could not even explain in later years, moved east to be ahead of the Germans. The Germans caught up with the three of us in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. When the order came out for Jews to report to the ghetto, we also had a nanny, a Polish woman by the name of Bronislava Korpi. And when the order went for Jews to go to the ghetto, my nanny basically said to them, listen, this is going to be a couple of weeks. Why don't you leave him with me? You'll come back, we'll be here, etc. The 4 weeks, the 4 months turned into 4 years. During those 4 years, she gave me a separate identity. She baptized me, paraded and acted as if I were a child. My parents were separated in the ghetto. My mother escaped the ghetto on the Aryan side. She then made contact with my nanny and myself. She provided for us food and whatever was necessary. I knew her as my aunt, and so for 2 years out of those 4 or 5 years, she would come and visit, and she was my aunt, and my nanny was my mother.
Do you have any recollection of this time?
Say that again?
Do you have any recollection? Do you have a vivid memory of the time with your nanny?
Ellen, it's very, very difficult for me to be able to distinguish between what is cognitive memory or what was told. I was one of those lucky ones whose parents survived. I remember when we had a hidden child conference 25 years ago, the most desperate, difficult thing was to look at the boards where people were trying to find somebody who could confirm something of their past. So I was lucky in the sense that my parents could tell me. On the other hand, I don't know what it is that I really remember and what it is that I was told. I remember when I was old enough to understand, my father, when we smuggled out of Poland after the war, when my father smuggled out pictures of my nanny and was old enough to know that that could have gotten us arrested. He said to me, smuggled out the pictures because I was not sure whether you would remember Branya. And I always wanted to make sure that for the rest of your life, you had the image of her in front of your eyes. So Ellen, honestly, I don't know. If I hadn't seen that picture, would she be in front of my, I don't know. But at least I have it. So at least I know that that's what she looked like and that's who she was.
So what was it like after the war? Now you're reunited with your parents, and what happened then?
Well, we lived together. The four of us lived together after the liberation because housing was an issue and a problem. And my parents, my father went to Baranovich, found out everybody perished, and said to my nanny, we are now a family of four. Whatever happens to us will happen. You will be part of that family. At which point she said, no, I saved him. He belongs to me, and later at the Catholic Church. And that's when difficulty started. She went to the KGB, said my father collaborated with the Germans. That's how he survived. The Soviets arrested him, interrogated him, let him go. A couple months later, my dad became a manager of a factory. She went again to the Soviets, said my father steals. They arrested him again. A third time she stole, brought to KGB. And after 3 of these incidents, the Soviets said to my parents that they don't have time for these private personal battles, that they have to take it to court. And so they did take it to trial. It was the first custody battle in Soviet liberated territory. We had an attorney, Adam Dimitrovsky, who later became professor of Russian at Brandeis University, who argued my parents' case. My parents won a trial and 2 appeals. And in fact, the Soviets wanted to incarcerate her because she was a troublemaker. My parents still said, no, we'll try to reconcile. It didn't happen. We were repatriated to Poland, to Lodz. She followed in Lodz. In Lodz, she had her relatives. I was kidnapped. My parents got together. Some Jewish survivors kidnapped me back. And then we smuggled the borders to get to the American zone in Austria. As my father said, at the age of 10, I was an old man.
Now, the time that you were with her, I got the impression that she took very good care of you and was very loving. So how does that play with, what she did after the war?
Well, again, there are certain things that, again, I don't know if I remember or I can visualize based on what I was taught. The period I am totally blank on is the period of the trial. I was told by my parents that I actually was housed at the home of the judge, because there's nowhere else to put me. But I have totally blacked out. I have no memory, no recollection. There's nothing that I can remember or see or visualize, because at that was the most difficult period. I had 2 mothers fighting for me. And it was at that moment that the decision was made I was to be with one. So, I get Dr. Ruth Westheimer said to me, you should go into therapy. You'll figure out all kinds of things that, you may not want to know, but I don't know. I really don't know. It had to have been difficult for a child.
Were you asked your opinion during the trial? Did they ask, Abe, what do you think about where you want to go?
No, her lawyer argued that I should be asked. The Catholic Church believes that if you have a child to the age of 6, they'll be Catholic forever. Well, I was under 6, and the judge ruled that I was too young to know what was best for me. Had I been asked, I would opt for her. I would opt for her, absolutely.
Well, that speaks to the fact that at least she took good care of you. So you were baptized when you were with her. You practiced Christianity. How did you come back to Judaism?
Okay, I went to church. I spit on Jews. I was properly raised. And when I saw Jews going from the ghetto, I spit on the dirty Jews. It was my father's wisdom. In the beginning, when we lived together after liberation, little by little, he introduced me to Judaism. For a child of 5 or 6, it's not a question of theology. It's a question of ritual, of what you're used to. And so I used to wear a cross. He took off my cross and he put on a talit katan, which is a little talit. And as far as I understood, this was part of growing up. Instead of wearing this on my body, I wore something else. He taught me, I used to say my prayers. I used to pray to Boja, I prayed to God. I prayed in Latin. My father taught me the Shema in Hebrew. I didn't understand Hebrew or Latin. It didn't matter as long as I knew that before I went to sleep, I prayed to Boja, I prayed to God. He also said to me, you now no longer have to kneel. And so it was he was very wise in finding substitution. The first time he took me to synagogue was on Simchat Torah. And on the way to synagogue, we passed a church. I crossed myself. We met a priest. I dropped my father's hand. I kissed the hand of the priest. Then we went on to synagogue. So it was, as long as I didn't have to make choices as a child. When we finally got to Austria and DP camp, displaced persons camp, the majority environment was Jewish. And so again, being Jewish in that sense was part of my growing up. I never questioned the theology, and it became a natural, and he was very wise in doing it the way that he did it.
Yeah, your father has, it sounds like he had incredible insight and understanding, and very, very fortunately so. So all this happens. Do you ever say goodbye to your nanny? How does that end?
It didn't end, so I don't have closure. It's the one element. For many, many years, Ellen, I spoke in third person about my experiences. And it wasn't till the first conference of hidden children, when I was asked to speak why we are here, that I froze. I remember I told my mother I don't want her to come. I don't want my wife and kids to come. Because all of a sudden here I was facing an audience where I was like they and they were like I. And it was always easier for me to talk about myself, not in the first person. And it was the first time that I had to deal with my experiences in the first person. And it was difficult, but it was very, very important.
Right. It's important that all survivors tell their stories. And for a long time, hidden children didn't tell their stories.
Well, the only thing that we had in our power was our silence. And therefore, to break that silence was very difficult. The other thing is Holocaust survivors who were hidden children felt embarrassed that maybe they didn't suffer. We weren't in Auschwitz, so they kept their, even when they were able to speak, they didn't speak because they felt a little bit embarrassed that their suffering was not as great as was the suffering of many of those who perished. The other element for some of them was also the question of religion. Growing up Jewish, you don't want to talk about that past. Growing up, I felt another embarrassment is I had no family. I went to yeshiva. My bar mitzvah there was no family. I had no aunts. I had no uncles. The word Zayda and Bubba was not part of my lexicon. So, I remember later the kids in high school said to me, boy, you had such an exciting life. We had such a boring life, and to me, I wish I had that boring life. But it was difficult to communicate and to also, then I don't have to tell those of you who survived, there is a guilt of survival. My parents struggled with it day and night. Why did they survive? Not their brothers, not their sisters, not their parents who were so much more righteous and bright, etc. And I guess to some extent, we hidden children have an element of that as well. And that too, for many years, served as a quiescence, that we wouldn't talk about it. We wouldn't talk about it.
Right. It's interesting that you spoke about sort of the hierarchy of among survivors, but no matter where you were during the Holocaust, if you were involved in the Holocaust, it was traumatic. It was, you know, something that you felt and stays with you for the rest of your life. Is some of those feelings, you think, still part of you now and part of your career choice of standing up to anti-Semitism?
You know what? It's almost an arrogant thought, because it goes to the reason of survival. And people have said to me, "Well, you survived, so you can do so and so and so and so." And respectfully, you know, who knows? God knows why. I was lucky, fortunate. My parents made a decision which they could never defend to me. That means whenever we would have a fight, I would throw, "You left me." That was the most painful thing that I could say to them. And they could never really rationalize why they did it. The fact that they did it saved my life and probably saved their lives. But so that, you know, to try to fathom why, and then to try to link it, well, I survived, so I can fight prejudice and anti-Semitism, is really a sense of arrogance. I don't know, but I am lucky in many ways, lucky to survive. I believe it's a miracle. My parents believed it was a miracle. They didn't blame God, they blamed man. My father saw the intervention of God in several situations where it was a question of life and death. I was raised in faith. I raised my children and grandchildren in faith. So I don't know. I do know I've been very lucky to have had the opportunity in my adult life to fight prejudice, anti-Semitism, which almost destroyed me, and have an opportunity to build understanding. Bronislava Korpi, to me, is a heroine, you know, with even the way it ended because of love. I remember I asked my father, why was it that if she loved me so much, it turned to hate? Because at the end, it was ugly. And he said to me, everything in excess is no good. Too rich, too poor, too smart, too stupid, too skinny, too fat. Too much love is also no good. And that too much love turned into hate. But still, to have been given this opportunity, and just to close, I have another opportunity today. I'm doing something else now. I'm involved in an effort to feed Holocaust survivors who are hungry in this country. So believe it or not, there are in this country Holocaust survivors below the poverty line. Yes. And the pandemic showed how vulnerable they are. They're not able to go to soup kitchens. They need kosher food. And so to have survived this and to now have an opportunity to raise funds to feed Holocaust survivors in the greater New York area, what a zchus, what a privilege. And how lucky am I? So, you know, the Metropolitan Council has given me that platform. And there's a lot of things, Ellen, you know, we can't help heal. There's a lot of things we can't do, and we're talking about some of the pain. But the one thing we can do is to make sure that Holocaust survivors never again go hungry. And I have that ability, that zchus, that privilege in the last year or so to be able to try to help them. So thank God. I don't know why, but I'm very lucky, and thank God for that.
Abe, your attitude and your outlook are wonderful. I love when you keep saying that you're lucky. And like you said, who knows how you ended up involved in the work that you do. But I think obviously you followed your heart, and it was important to you, and you were saved, and you give back to so many people and so many organizations throughout your lifetime. And I commend you for that and appreciate that on behalf of survivors. So I'm gonna wrap up now, and thank you again, Abe, for being here today, for talking with us and sharing your story.
Thanks for listening.
My pleasure.
So now we turn from Poland to France. And Matthew, if you could get that little film ready. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ruth Cap-Hearts. She spends her time nowadays going to schools and speaking to students about her experience. And so we're going to just show you a little video clip to show you that aspect of her work.
More than 70 years ago, Madame Ruth Cap-Hearts was just a child during World War II. Her family was Jewish and was forced to hide. She and her parents survived, however, she lost many loved ones in the Holocaust, including her aunt who died tragically on the train a week after being liberated. Professor Sharon Wilkinson teaches Ruth's story to better understand France's involvement during that time.
She uses a different method of teaching the war. By ditching the textbook, students use the advances of technology, in particular, having a Skype with history itself.
As you know, history can repeat itself. Unfortunately, it does repeat.
I think it's really an exciting opportunity to talk to someone who has that living memory.
Talking to Madame Hartz was a very enriching experience, I think, for all of us.
She continues to share her story while giving this universal message.
We need to judge someone not by their religion, the color of their skin, or their family, but by the humanity in each person.
It's very surreal for me to, read about her story and then actually talk with her one-on-one.
Her story cherished for generations to come. Reporting for the Smithsonian, I'm Alex Kirkpatrick.
Ruth, hello.
Hello, Olivia.
So you were called Renee. Can you talk about that aspect of all hidden children, that they were given new identities with new names, new stories? So yeah. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, at the age of 4 in Toulouse, France, these are my earliest memories. I had an older cousin, Jeanette, who told me from now on, your name is Renee. I said, why? Because this is wartime and we could be arrested because we're Jewish. What does that mean? I said. She said, don't ask questions. This is very, very dangerous. Don't tell anyone where you live, your parents, and maybe even me, because there are a lot of people out there who could denounce us. This letter, and in those days, names from the Old Testament were considered Jewish. And besides, if you wanted to survive, you had to take on a false identity, which is name. I had a false last name. I had a false address. False place of birth. And it's interesting, I don't think I ever revealed anything. I was able to play this role. And even though it's very difficult for a young child to take on a different personality. My parents originally came from Germany, where they lived there for generations. My mother was from Ingelheim on the Rhine, my father near Mainz. That's where Gutenberg invented the printing press. And my father had actually lost a brother in World War I, and his mother had the Iron Cross, so they thought they wouldn't, be arrested when Hitler came to power, and of course we all know better. My parents wanted to emigrate to the United States, and of course that became impossible. My father did have an uncle who tried to get an affidavit, but he wasn't able to, so they went to Palestine. That's where I was born. But then the uncle in New York said, well, I'm going to personally go to the State Department, and if you go to France, maybe you could leave from Le Havre, which has ships leaving for New York. And that's how my parents ended up in France, where my mother had a brother, and World War II broke out. We first were put in a refugee camp, but then there begins a very hideous and shameful part of French history, because 7 months after the beginning of the war, in June of 1940, Maréchal Pétain, who had been a World War I hero, signed a treaty with Hitler promising to fully collaborate with him. And it was very dangerous to be Jewish in France. They had to wear the yellow star. The French set up camps there. And so my parents decided that they would try to get false IDs. By some miracle, my mother had reached Toulouse before all of France became occupied, and that's why I ended up getting my name in Toulouse. You needed a lot of luck in order to survive. And my father was able to get false IDs for them because children didn't have IDs by a clerk at City Hall. And in a way, he was a resistance member, a silent resistance member, because he used an authentic card and put on, false information. This same man one day came running to our room, could hardly call it an apartment, and said, I think there's one train leaving tonight. It may be the last one. I know I got an ordinance that there's going to be a big roundup of Jews tonight. And please run to the station as fast as you can, because you're on the list of people to be arrested. So my father said, well, I have an older brother, Jeanette's parents, I'd like to warn him. He said, well, let me know where they live, but you better run to the station. There were thousands of people at the station, and my uncle and his family never made it. We arrived in the middle of nowhere. We're taken in by a farm, and then the next day, we made our way to a small town, small village really, called Arthez of 2,000 people. We were given a room, and the people who lived above us were the Feydeau family. My parents had no money left by then. The Feydeaus were very nice. They shared their food with us, and there were other refugees in the village. And finally, Monsieur Feydeau told my father, are you Jewish by any chance? And my father said yes. He had this uncanny way of who he could trust and who he couldn't trust. And Monsieur Feydeau said, the room that you're occupying now was occupied by a Jewish family, and they were taken away. And we promised ourselves if ever there would be another family, we would do everything in our power to protect them. And they did. He gave my father a job at the local factory. Of course, there were informers in the village, so a little bit of money he was making, he had to give to some of the informers. There was a one-room schoolhouse in the village, and I'm jumping ahead. By then I was 6, I was in first grade, and most days it was too dangerous to go, but on those days when I went, I would have a very nice girl on my right who was actually in second grade, and she shared a sandwich with me, and she said, you always seem to be hungry. I know a lady at the edge of the village. She has a little vegetable garden. Maybe she'll give you some food. So one day after school, without warning my mother, I went to see this lady who ended up being Madame Vallat. And I always had this doll with me because the Feydeaus had 2 daughters, and one was Lucette, and she was in charge of protecting me, and she wasn't playing with dolls anymore, so she had given me her doll. And Madame Vallat said, oh, you must be the new little refugee girl, one of the little refugee girls. And then she had some bottles of wine because people had small vineyards in that part of southern France. And I must have overheard my father say to my mother on a Friday night what I wouldn't give for a glass of wine. And here this little girl had the nerve to tell this lady, and my father likes wine. She said, okay, I'll give you a bottle, but it's very precious. We made it before the war, but you're so cute, and I'll give it to you. And in exchange, I told her, and here's my doll for you for giving me all this. She said, no, put the doll on top of the bottle, and this way, nobody will see that you're even carrying it. When I arrived home, first of all, my mother was worried, and she said, where did you get this? You're not to steal it. I didn't steal it. This lady gave it to me. She said, well, they need it as much as we do. Why don't we return it? And that's how my mother met Madame Vallat, who told her, if my husband and I can ever do anything for you, please let us know. And 2 weeks after that episode, 2 French policemen came to the door. Just to give you an idea of my size, I was at eye level with the buckle of their belt. And they said, where's your father? Of course, I was so conditioned that I said, my father, I haven't seen him in 1,000 years, and you're not going to find him. My mother had just gone on an errand, so I was with a babysitter, whom they pushed her away right away, knowing she wasn't my mother. They went to the window, and they said, last time you saw your father, which way did he go? By then I was hysterical, and I just pointed in 2 different directions. And I could hear one say to the other, shall we take her? Because they took children as hostages, knowing that the parents would follow. And I could tell the other one didn't have his heart in it. And he said, let's wait and see what the rest of the day will bring. Of course, by then my mother was hysterical. Madame Feydeau said, let little Renee handle it. If she leaves with them, you can always join her. But she realized we couldn't stay there another minute. They could come back any moment. My father luckily had been warned in the factory. And so she went over to Madame Vallat because she knew that they had a basement and a cellar. And so she explained what happened, and the Vallat said, can we spend the night with you? And she said, absolutely. Well, the first night turned into days, that turned into weeks, that turned into months. And they were very kind people. They actually built a wall parallel to their own wall, a little similar to when Frank was in an attic. We were in the cellar, and it's true of many Jewish children, certainly not all, that we were often in very narrow spaces, in total darkness, and in total silence. Well, when you're 6 years old, it's hard to keep silence. So one day my mother packed a few things that I had, and I said, where am I going? She said, well, you're so pale. This lady's going to pick you up and you're going to get some fresh air. And then she'll come back and you'll come back and be with us. That lady had a car. We never saw a car in the village during the war, and had two children. I had seen them once or twice, didn't know them. And she drove and drove and drove and arrived at this big foreboding building, left us across the street, and this lady came out of that building dressed in black. Long story short, she was a nun. I'd never seen a lady like that. And I remember thinking, this is absolutely the strangest lady I've ever seen. Turns out that she was the mother superior of this convent. It was a convent. And Madame Khan was a lady who took us and said, this is my daughter, Emmy. This is my son, Jean-Claude. Turns to me and says, this is my other daughter. Of course, I wasn't told. I remember thinking, she's not my mother. What happened to my parents? But of course, we were sworn to silence, so I didn't say anything. That had all been prearranged, but I was too young to understand this whole thing. So she took us inside and introduced us to the nuns who would take care of us. We saw soldiers milling about, sometimes speaking to children. And one day, Mother Superior came running to the cafeteria and gathered 7 of us. And she said, suivez-moi, follow me. She took us to the chapel. There was a trap door, and she said, descendez, go down there. And we could hear the conversation going on above our heads. One male voice speaking German, one male voice speaking French. We understand that you're hiding Jewish children. She said, me hide Jewish children? Why would I do such a dangerous thing? Had they had dogs, they would have found us. We could hear the sound of their boots, and they finally walked away. And she left us down there for another day and a half, and just told us to go back to our dorms. Again, moving fast forward, then D-Day rolled around, and now there was a military war going on the soil of France, and so many of the Germans left. And so what happened was, in that Catholic institution, it was very large, and there was a wing actually occupied by the local Gestapo. You can imagine the risk that this Mother Superior took. And the other wing was occupied by the French milice, the French police. And she knew that. That's why these 2 men were there when we heard the conversation. So luckily, my parents also survived. In fact, it will be 75 years that we have been reunited, because France was liberated August 25th, 1944. As you all know, the war was far from over, but we were reunited. My parents, my father worked as a farmhand very high up in the mountain that you can only reach on foot. And my mother stayed with the Vallats. And finally on a Sunday, she said, come to church with me. I'll just say that you're a cousin from a nearby town. And apparently they didn't bother her, because my parents never talked to me about the war. And we made our way back to Paris. And there, when I went to school, the Jewish children seemed to know who who we were, and we sort of gathered together. And that is the very first time in my young life that I was called a dirty Jew. One child, or maybe two, it wasn't a mob, pointed to us, oh, you dirty Jews, we thought they all killed you. So of course, like Abraham Foxman said, we kept quiet and silent. We had a visit from the Red Cross, and that's where I saw my father break down. He had lost his entire family. His father died before the war, but his mother, two sisters, his brother in France, a nephew, and many, many cousins. My mother lost a dear sister. Her parents were sent in a camp, Theresienstadt or Terezin. They did survive that camp, came to live with us, never talked about it. So after the war, we hidden children kept silence and kept in hiding for many, many, many more years.
Should we show those photos that you wanted us to show? Matthew, perhaps you can put them up.
Sure. Okay, so now I go back every 2 or 3 years to Arthez, which is a small town where we were hidden. And I befriended a local journalist whose father was in the resistance. He actually was sent to Buchenwald. And he works diligently in finding families who rescued Jews during the war. And as you can see, there were 4 families that rescued Jews during the war and were recognized by Yad Vashem. So this is a plaque in the village, and it's called the Garden of the Righteous Among the Nations. And the previous picture again, please. Yeah. And the Dubec and Igalin saved another Jewish family who I actually discovered for speaking in Virginia Beach one year. And then our two rescuers, the Fedus and the Valas, who at the peril of their lives saved Jews under the Nazi occupation. Since it's in French, I want you to know what it meant. So now they have this plaque in the middle of this little village of 3,000 inhabitants. The mayor is one of my best friends. Each time I come, he has a big reception and invites everybody who wants to come. And of course, the French have a wonderful way to, you know, have wine and goodies. So next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so it was very, very difficult for me to recognize Mother Superior as righteous among the nations. I won't go into the details because the nuns had long left and it was very hard for me to locate them. This was long before we all had computers. So I decided that a plaque should be placed. What was the convent, it then became a cultural center, and I just heard last year that they were going to have an equestrian, you know, a horseback riding center there. So you can't miss this plaque as you walk in the big courtyard. And it says here, Mother Superior Rosalie hid at the peril of her life Jewish children in 1943 and 44, innocent victims of the barbaric Nazi and Vichy regimes. With this commemorative plaque, we honor her extraordinary courage. And then they used a very famous saying in the Talmud, one who saves one life saves all of humanity. And this plaque was exposed on October 4th, 2007 by me, Ruth Cap-Hearts, one of the children that she saved. And the mayor of Sorez, where the institution is, you know, was there for the ceremony and was instrumental really in putting up this plaque. Next. And in 1982, I was interviewed by Nora Levin from Gratz College, who was the first person to found the oral archives at Gratz College. And she wanted to know what happened to children. And she came over and interviewed me, and I couldn't answer many of her questions because, like I said, after the war, when I asked questions about my life during the war, my parents said, "C'est trop triste, it's too sad." So they never answered my questions. And that's when I realized that I had to write down what happened to us. My children were going to college and they were going to be faced with these deniers accounts. So I was extremely worried. And I actually collaborated with one of my former students. I taught French and history at a college preparatory school in the Philadelphia area called Springside School. And so we collaborated, and my memoir has been published in 1999 under the title, Your Name is Renee, by Oxford University Press. It is used in many schools and also colleges. And on the right is my wonderful rescuer, Lucette, who was a teenager during the war. She's the one who gave me the doll. She's 93 years young there, and she's truly an absolute treasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. What a story. So now we turn to my own family history, since I'm bringing you the living history of my mother, who's going to tell her story in Belgium. So my mother was trained as a lawyer and then was a French teacher when she came to America, and then became a psychologist. And now she's going to tell you her story. Hi, Mom.
Hi, everybody. In my long life, I've been introduced many times, but I've never been more proud than to be introduced as Olivia's mom. So here's my story. Olivia's dad, who was my husband of 62 years, was with his family saved. He was a refugee, and the family was saved thanks to visa from Sousa Mendes. My mother's history, or my history, is different. My mother tried to escape with the last train, but there was no more train, and she was forced to take me by foot, trying to escape into France, into free France. So we traveled with her and with my grandparents. It was a harrowing trip with bombs falling on both sides. And at the age of 3.5, I was a child in a caravan. And we walked and walked for days, but at some point we were forced to turn back. My mother tried to find an alternative route, and we found ourselves separated. And I was taken back to Antwerp with my grandparents. There was no way to communicate. We didn't know that my mother was alive. We thought she must have died. My father was in the military, and my grandparents kept saying that surely he has been dead in the big battles raging at the time. So I was an orphan for a while. And by the time my mother was able to come to Antwerp to fetch me, I acted as if I didn't recognize her. I thought she was a ghost. I had lost many, many kilos of my weight. I had refused to eat, and I was letting myself die. And I want you all to realize that that was what childhood depression looks like. And this is what our government has been doing to children at our southern border. So just remember that. Well, I was reunited with my mother, and then my father went AWOL when he heard that the Belgian army was going to surrender, and he managed to make his way back to Brussels. And we were together again, and my parents in time switched to Plan B. Plan B was to found the resistance, the Jewish resistance in Brussels. These are my parents. My mother, they say about her, war name was Denise Dumont. And both my parents have been recognized posthumously by the Bnei Brit in Jerusalem for the Comité de Défense des Juifs that found hiding places for thousands of Jewish children. Comité de Défense des Juifs means Committee to Defend the Jews. My father was one of the leaders, but my mother was one of the hardest creative minds in that committee. My father, who became very well known for his work, academic work, turned to doing resistance work during the war. So he wrote a book on justice during all that time. And he said, my house was on fire and I simply took a pail of water to help extinguish the flame. That is something that he said after the war, when the Belgian government was dispensing medals to reward the heroes of the underground. He refused every medal. My mother, she loved the Blink, so she took them all. They create, I want to say and recognize Dr. Mordechai Paldiel, who has made his mission to recognize Jews who saved Jews, who are not recognized at Yad Vashem. But he's thought rightly that they also deserve to be recognized. Thankfully, the Belgian people are not steeped in anti-Semitism. So there were a lot of people who were helping with the resistance and the underground. Among them was the man at the right, Emile Blakes. This is a much later picture of him, who not only was one of my rescuers, but also did a lot of dangerous work on behalf of the resistance. He was a courier for the resistance. He hid papers for my parents, etc. I was probably the first hidden child in Belgium, because even though the Germans at first did not arrest Belgian people, and my parents were Belgian citizens, my parents felt that their dangerous work made them special targets, and they didn't think that they could really expose me to that. So the first place I went to was the Forani home, and the picture on the left is one of me at age 5 with the two Forani girls, 4 and 3. I didn't stay very long at the Forani home, because one day one of the friends of Madame Forani came to the house and started the conversation with me and says, "Do you come here often?" And I said, "No, I don't come here. I live here. I'm a Jewish child in hiding." Well, everybody thought that was a really funny story, but my mother thought that funny story is going to be overheard by the wrong person at some point. So she immediately took me out of that home, and this is when she asked the Blakes family to take me in. The Blakes were living next door, but in their home, they were very, very poor. They had no indoor plumbing. They had a 4-room house, but they took me in, they made room for me. And Philippe Blakes, the son, was 6 years older than me, treated me as his baby sister. And as I said, Emile Blakes had a much wider role even in the resistance, helping with the Jewish resistance. Emile Blakes has been recognized by Yad Vashem. Now, while I was at the Blakes, I was going to school I was in public school, but I was expelled from kindergarten. Why? Because the Germans announced that Jewish children are no longer allowed to go to school with other children. So there I was expelled. I had no school. Well, my mother decided that her daughter needed a school, and her way was always to think, if my daughter needs it, all other children need that. So she created a school for all the Jewish children. And that school was called No Petit, or Little Ones. She hired the principal, she hired teachers, some Jews, some not. In this picture, she's there with the yellow star in the middle, wearing a little hat. She was always in hat and high heels. And next to her is a young woman called Jeanne Damon, who is also being recognized by Yad Vashem. Jeanne Damon was a young girl who was training to be a teacher. She lived in the countryside. She had never met Jews, but when she heard about the horrible things happening to Jews, she felt that was absolutely unfair. And she asked around, what can she do to help? And people sent her to Fela Perelman. And she became my mother's main helper throughout the war. Now, this was the school No Petit where I started first grade. And I know exactly how old I was when I started first grade because Mr. Blakes had taken me to the school and told me to come home by streetcar. And when I boarded the streetcar, was asked to pay. I said, I don't have to pay. I'm not 6 years old yet. Well, obviously that didn't sit very well. Somebody else wound up paying for me. Otherwise, I would have had to walk 5 miles. For children who didn't have easy transportation, my mother went to Brussels administration and says, well, the Belgian government is mandated by law to provide transportation for children, so you have to provide streetcars for the children to go to school. If you look in the dictionary for the word chutzpah, you will find a picture of my mother, because there she goes and she mandates that the Belgian government has to provide a special streetcar for Jewish children, and they did. Well, unfortunately, the Jewish school No Petit did not last very long. Did not last very long because one day somebody was arrested, a family was arrested, and they say, we cannot leave without our child. Olivia, I seem to have disappeared from the screen. We cannot leave without our child. And the Gestapo went to the school to find the child, wound up arresting some teachers, and it was time at that moment to close the school. When the school was closed, my mother called every mother of the children in the school and said, I cannot tell you what to do, but I have put my child away from me to keep her safe. And I suggest that you do the same. And if you do not have a place where to put her or him, we will help you. And the We Will Help You became a very, very organized system to actually hide hidden children. They were, the Jewish community was somehow connected, and then they took the children and brought them to a place where they would be safe. There were a number of priests who were helpful and found homes in the countryside. The resistance had funny ways, funny stories sometimes. They used to speak in code over the phone to make sure that in case their phone is tapped, that they should not be understood. So they had a way to refer to children in the system as packages. And one day somebody calls my mother's assistant and says, a package has arrived. And Jeanne answers, how old is the package? Anyway, the school was closed. And at that point, I really needed another school. So my mother went to the director of a progressive school called the Ahmed School and asked the director, would you take my daughter? And Mademoiselle Ahmed said, I cannot take her in my home. She understood that my mother wanted her to hide me. So she said, I cannot take her in my home, but I will ask my best teachers, who was Lucie Monnier. So my I found at that time a new home as well as a school. And so the next school year, I started at the med school. By that time, I had an assumed name. And things were getting tighter and tighter. And from the next 2 years, I didn't see my parents at all. Before that, I could see them occasionally, but now no more. Now, when I arrived at the home of Lucie and Louise Monnier, they had a big dog called Celt. Celt was a Malinois shepherd, the same kind of dog who was used by our military in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they had, Lucie had put a barrier between one room and the other to make sure that the dog does not attack the intruder and that he has some time to get used to me. But being an impetuous child, I paid no attention to the barrier. I immediately ran to the dog. I started kissing him and hugging him, and he started licking me, and within minutes, we were completely bonded. And Celt was a shepherd, and I became his flock. And through the 2 years that I lived with Lucie and Louise, he took very good care of me. He would walk along the street to the side of the street as far as he was allowed to go and watch me going to school. And he would wait for me at the end of school. And nobody would hurt me. If they would ever try to hurt me, they would have had to kill that dog. Now, I was extraordinarily lucky with Louise and Lucie Monnier. Lucie Monnier was a teacher, and she was so sensitive to everything that I needed. She spent time explaining to me daily that the Jews are fantastic people, that we have contributed so much to the world, and I should be very proud to be a Jew. And at the same time, she would telling me the Nazis are bad and they are mean, but they will be vanquished. And one day you'll be able to again get your name and you'll be able to see your family again, and so on and so on. So that when liberation happened, I ran to school and told all of my classmates, no, I can tell you my real name is NOEMI PERELMAN and I am Jewish. And all the other children heard me, and they didn't know obviously what Jewish means, but they started saying, you bragging. I had such pride in the way I was announcing this to the world. So I was.
So now let's show a little video clip. Matt, if you could cue that up, please.
The Liberation Day was one of the most joyous days of my life. The American Army came into Brussels, their trucks and tanks and whatever, and everybody went on the street. And I remember rushing to wherever, and I was picked up by the American soldiers who were so happy after I've been fighting the Germans, you know, and being in ugly places. Suddenly they are in a town where everybody welcomes them and loves them, and they see children. Right? They were so joyous to see children. So I know that I went blocks, many blocks, on the lap of an American soldier who picked me up from the ground, put me on his lap and on that truck, and they were so happy to be able to hug a child, which they had not done. But I don't know who this guy is. He didn't speak French, I didn't speak English, we had no language, but there was the joy that these men had come to save us. I had so much looked forward to coming home, but when I came home, it wasn't exactly what I had expected. I came home a couple of months after liberation because my mother and my parents needed to get their house built up together again. But when I came home, my mother had taken into our house a whole lot of young people who had been in the camps and Brindong. Those were refugees who were coming back from the concentration camps. And now they were in those refugee camps, and my mother would go visit every day, and there were kids there who would call her Madame Maman, and she, Mrs. Mommy. Yeah, this is not yet the right picture, Olivia. This comes later. So we came, when I came home, there were all of these other people. I had expected to be reunited real close to my parents, but not at all. You know, my mother cared about me, but she cared about all these other children and all these other people just as much. She was thought I was doing okay. So she was prioritizing the neediest of them all. My mother started creating orphanages. And Olivia and I went to Jerusalem in 2007. There was a convention of hidden children from Belgium. Many of them remembered my mother. She created 4 orphanages. The psychologist was put in charge by the name of Ziggy Hirsch. And they all devised an extraordinary system to help all these children because they asked young people who were coming back from concentration camps and had suffered horrific trauma. They were the people who took care of the orphans in the orphanage. So you had people who really understood the depths of trauma, and they created new families. Now, obviously, because those were Jewish orphanages, my mother made sure that there was also a piano teacher and a violin teacher. My mother wanted to make sure that children remained Jewish, but she was an ardent Zionist, and for her, remaining Jewish meant going to Palestine. And for those children who didn't have families and who didn't have anybody claiming them, she arranged for them to go to Palestine. And some people may disagree with that because she took them away from the families that had taken care of them. But she wanted the Nazi to be defeated in every way, including not letting the Jewish children be Jewish no more. Now, Abe Foxman has spoken very eloquently about the silence, the fact that we never spoke about whatever happened. And that is in fact something that's true for all trauma survivors who don't speak about what happened. And my mother especially never spoke about the fact that almost her entire family had been exterminated at Auschwitz. She couldn't talk about that. My mother and I never spoke together about our separation, about the trauma that had existed. And I kept silent until 1990, when the Anne Frank exhibit came to Salt Lake City and people were asking for volunteers to help. And I was ashamed to remain silent. So I let myself be known. And I was asked to give the inaugural speech at that event. That was in front of 4 TV stations and several newspapers and all the notables. And that day, I literally lost my voice. I could not speak. The next year, my mother died. And we went to Belgium to take care of her belongings. And we found in the way, way back of her drawer, some postcards that she had kept, never shown me, postcards that were addressed to me, by my grandparents and my Aunt Marilka. And Olivia has noticed that the date that they sent me this, which was for my 5th birthday, was 11 days before they were arrested and deported. So it's probably the last thing that they ever wrote. And those postcards have a stamp of Hitler. They are written in German to be able to go through censorship. The text is anodyne, but just seeing them, their last words to me, I realized that they were not an abstraction. Those people really, really, really loved me. They were real. And that became such a shock, these postcards from the grave 50 years later. And they were like fire. I couldn't touch them. They were burning me. And I realized after that that I had the hardest time ending or processing the grief of my mother. And it took me quite a while to do it because I realized that I needed not only to process losing my mother, but I had to process her losing our entire family. I had to process the grief that she never shared with me. And also I had to go back to being a 3-year-old child who had been orphaned before. I want to thank all the people who have signed on today. I want to thank you for your courage in hearing our story. And there may be some people in the audience, either survivors or children of survivors, who are still maintaining their silence. And I urge you to find somebody that you can talk to, somebody who will tell you, I want to hear what you have to say. Please tell me your story. Thank you.
So we will now turn back to our 3 speakers just for some final thoughts. But before we do, I want to tell you very briefly about our upcoming program. Just going to tell you about our immediate upcoming program, which will be on a much happier note. It's called The Journey That Saved Curious George. And Curious George, the beloved storybook character, was written by German Jews who were rescued by Aristides de Souza Mendes. And they escaped with a manuscript to the first Curious George book in their suitcase, which they then published in New York in 1941. So without Souza Mendes and his courage, there would have been no Curious George. And that's the topic for next week, and I hope you will all sign on. You'll have information about that program and other programs in the email you get later today. And I know that Ellen has put information about her upcoming programs in the chat box, so please do sign on for her programs as well. So now, very quickly, let's go back to our speakers for some final thoughts, starting with you, Mr. Abraham Foxman.
Word of perspective and a final word. Perspective is, I don't know how many of us realize that the overwhelming majority of hidden children were female. I didn't realize it till we had that first convention of hidden children. It was much safer to hide a girl than it was to hide a Jewish boy. And that's just a matter of reality and fact. My last comment is in line with Dr. Naomi. Hidden children, we are the last generation of survivors. And we have an obligation to bear witness, not necessarily to bear witness to the horrors, to the evils that many of us witness, but to the other side, which we are a living testament. We are living proof that if good people act, if good people stand up, they can make a difference. The difference can be from stopping a hurt and a sly and an insult, and it can reach all the way to saving a human life. I think it is important for our children, our grandchildren, and for those of us who are struggling to find a better future, to be able to embrace examples of goodness, of courage, of heroism, of decency. And so, Olivia, today was a program of good news because, as we said, you know, the Talmud says, if you save one life, you save a world. Wow, there were many worlds represented here today. And I think we have that obligation, primarily for our children and grandchildren, to say, there are good people, and you too can make a difference. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to share.
It feels like such a privilege. Ruth, it's your turn now for some final thoughts.
Thank you. Well, I totally agree with Abraham Foxman. And my final thoughts concern my feelings about the valor and courage of my rescuers, which I realized for the first time in 1969 when I returned to the village of Arthez. Madame Fédou was still alive and a great-grandmother. I had not warned them that I was coming. Lucette gathered the whole family together and held a special celebration. We all cried of joy to be reunited. We did not discuss the war years, only what had happened since. When I asked Madame Fédou, what can I do for you? You saved my life. She responded that it was a natural thing to do. It never occurred to the family to explain their actions, why they had risked their lives to save us. To this day, they are unable to fathom why so many people had remained indifferent at best, at worst had actually collaborated with the Nazis and denounced Jews who were then sent to their death. It was the first time for me that there was some closure. I saw how authentic and sincere these people were, and I experienced a sense of peace and gratitude, which had long eluded me. Their actions came from a common heritage of persecution. Their ancestors had suffered the injustices of the feudal system, of the church, and those of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th and 20th century. Perhaps this gave them a sense of unknown mission when confronted with the evil of the Holocaust. Their actions on behalf of so many innocents have left us a legacy which must be remembered, and if fulfilled, will hopefully help prevent a recurrence of the Nazi horrors. It is important to show courage, compassion, strength, and hope while we remember our hidden childhoods. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming. I'm extremely grateful. Thank you, Olivia.
Yes, and Dr. Mattis, Mom, the word goes to you.
Yes. Well, you asked me, Olivia, you asked me about gratitude. And did I feel gratitude as a child? And I told you, no, not as a child, because a child expects to be taken care of. It's a birthright of a child to have adults caretaking her. But looking in retrospect as an adult, as I came into my own adult strengths, I could see what extraordinary people came my way and what they did for me. And in times of great sorrow, the real character of people shows up, and the hierarchy of the world is completely upended because the people who saved me were ordinary people. The Blake's family was very, very poor. Lucie Monnier was a simple teacher and pretty much of a recluse outside of that. And yet, in that moment, they became giants. And history can look back and see the character shining throughout time.
Well, my profound gratitude. Please, Ellen, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to everyone for being here and the speakers who told their stories from your heart. As the child of a hidden child, and to all of those out there who are children of hidden children, we have a responsibility and an obligation to understand our parents, our hidden children parents, and what they went through. And despite all of that, the uncertainty and the fear. Most of them, for the most part, built a very happy and productive life, and they had us and gave us joy. And I look back and what my mother went through and have an understanding of hidden children, and comes from a place of love. And their story is important. And it's important that we tell it in the future and carry it with us. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you to Ellen as my co-host. Thank you to all of our illustrious panelists. And of course, thank you, all of you, for giving almost an hour and a half of your Sunday to us. And we hope to see you at our future programs. So have a nice rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.